By the winter of 1546, King Henry VIII of England was no longer the formidable monarch who had once bestrode the continent like a colossus. The man who had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and taken 6 wives in pursuit of an heir had become something else entirely. He was now a swollen, rotting husk of his former self, barely able to move, consumed by infection, paranoia, and the lingering ghosts of his own brutality. He ruled, yes, but he no longer lived. The court whispered behind gloved hands. The nobles bowed with trembling knees, and Henry, the once glorious Lion of England, sat upon a throne that might as well have been a tomb. The scent came before the king did, before he entered any room, before his voice rasped out commands. His presence was betrayed by the stench of his legate, ulcerated wound that leaked pus and blood into the wrappings that failed to contain it. Physicians had long since given up on healing him. They sought now only to preserve the illusion of vitality. The wound was older than most of the courtiers who surrounded him, a souvenir from a jousting accident decades earlier, when Henry had been thrown from his horse and crushed beneath it. Infection had taken root, and time had made it worse. The king, once known for his athleticism and handsomeness, was now a figure of horror. He weighed over 400 pounds, needed mechanical devices to lift him from his bed, and was increasingly unable to walk. His mobility was reduced to a few staggering steps, his bulk wrapped in silk and ermine like a bloated corpse prepared for burial. But it wasn't just his body that decayed. Henry's mind, once sharp and ruthless, had begun to fray at the edges. He was plagued by visions, or perhaps memories, who could say which. He often muttered in his sleep, names echoing from behind the thick drapes of his bed. Anna Thomas, Woolsey. More, sometimes he would wake screaming, clawing at the air, demanding to know who had betrayed him. His courtiers learned to stay away unless summoned. Even his last wife, Catherine Parr, walked with careful steps, and chose her words like a prisoner might handle a blade. He would summon his council, issue decree, and play at ruling with the same iron will that had decapitated wives and advisors alike. But there were also days, more and more of them, when he vanished into his own mind. He would stare into the fire for hours, unmoving, eyes glassy with pain and something worse. In those long silences, one could almost believe he was communing with the dead. And there were many dead to speak to. So many heads had rolled, so many screams had echoed through the tower's cold walls, that even the stones of Whitehall felt soaked in blood. Those who served him feared him more than ever, for his wrath had grown unpredictable. He might reward a courtier with gold one moment and accuse him of treason the next. The line between loyalty and disloyalty had vanished. One could be executed for following orders to well or not well enough. His paranoia had metastasized into something monstrous. He trusted no one, not even his own children. Edward, his long-awaited son, was kept at a distance, raised by tutors, and guarded day and night. Mary and Elizabeth, his daughters by 2 doomed wives, were tolerated but never embraced. Henry had created a dynasty, but now seemed to fear it would consume him. Each day was a performance of power. Musicians played softly outside his chambers, pretending not to flinch at his servants moved silently through the halls, praying they would not be noticed. Doctors examined him with trembling hands, reporting false optimism while avoiding his gaze. And through it all, the king waited. For what? No one knew. Perhaps for death, perhaps for redemption, perhaps for the last act in the bloody play he had written with his own hands. By December, his physical state had worsened to the point where it could no longer be hidden. He suffered from fevers that left him delirious, his skin hot and mottled, his urine turned dark and foul-smelling, and he often cried out in pain during the night. The great canopy bed, once a symbol of royal grandeur, had become a prison. He could not leave it without assistance, and even then, the effort left him gasping and slick with sweat. His wound had become maggots were rumored to have been found in the bandages, though such things were never confirmed aloud. No one dared speak of anything, really. Henry's appetite, legendary in earlier years, had not waned. He devoured meat, pies, sweetmeats, and wine with ravenous intensity, as though trying to feed the void opening beneath him. But the food did him no favors. His digestion faltered. He grew more bloated, more foul. Some believed he was being eaten alive from the inside, that God had decided no blade or poison was worthy of him, and instead cursed him with a slower death. He had become a spectacle of divine retribution, a walking, or rather, lying embodiment of excess, cruelty, and the futility of power. And yet he still ruled. Treaties were signed. Death warrants were issued. A new wave of executions swept through the court. As Henry sought to secure his legacy by silencing all dissent, he ordered the arrest and beheading of his old friend and ally, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Even his son, Henry Howard Earl of Surrey, a brilliant poet and nobleman, was sent to the block. There was no logic to it anymore. Henry was not pruning threats. He was lashing out like a cornered animal. The court held its breath, knowing that no one, no matter how noble or loyal, was truly safe. The smell of death had seeped into the very walls. The candles in his chambers burned day and night, not for light, but to mask the odor. But even that failed. Visitors often left pale and shaken, their stomachs turning from the stifling air. The priests who came to offer last rites were turned away. Henry would not hear of death, not yet. He insisted he would recover. He spoke of future campaigns, of glory yet to be won. He made plans for Edward's reign, though he never once called the boy to his bedside. It was as though admitting weakness would hasten the end, as if by a sheer will, he could hold death at bay. But death was coming. It had been circling for years, a patient shadow, growing bolder now with each passing hour. And as January 1547 arrived, even the most loyal began to prepare for a world without Henry. The court grew quieter still. Letters were written in secret. Alliances formed in whispers. The king's breath grew shallower, and behind closed doors, those who had survived his reign dared to hope for peace, or power, or simply the end of a long, terrifying chapter in English history. The beginning of January 1547 brought with it an icy stillness, as if even nature paused to witness the slow demise of England's most formidable king. The skies above London remained perpetually grey, cloaking the palace in a sullen gloom that seemed to settle in the bones. Inside Whitehall, the hearths were lit constantly, but no warmth could touch the chill that permeated the royal apartments. Courtiers moved with the solemnity of mourners before the burial, and every creaking floorboard or distant footstep echoed like a knell. By now, the king's body had begun to betray him entirely. His legs were so swollen that movement was impossible without a crane-like apparatus, built specifically to hoist his enormous frame from the bed. Even then, the pain was excruciating. The ulcer on his leg was a chasm of rot, endlessly oozing and filled with the stench of death. His groans were a constant soundtrack to life in the palace, reverberating through the corridors and chilling the marrow of anyone unfortunate enough to hear them. Attendants changed his linens daily, but nothing could stem the seep. His skin broke open in sores. Gangrene was suspected, and though his doctors dared not speak the word, everyone knew its meaning. Decay, irreversible and final. His mind, too, continued to spiral downward. Once a shrewd manipulator of power and perception, Henry was now trapped in a fog of confusion and suspicion. He would wake screaming at invisible figures. He demanded the presence of people long dead: Wolsey, Cromwell, Jane Seymour. He accused Catherine Parr of plotting to poison him, of conspiring with reformers to usurp his legacy. When she came to soothe him, he screamed and lashed out, striking her with a heavy goblet that left a dark bruise beneath her eye. She did not return again. She stayed in her own chambers, praying for peace, or perhaps just survival. But Henry's delusions were more than mere hallucinations. In some twisted sense, they were confessions. As he slipped further from reality, the voices he heard, the ghosts he spoke to, were all those he had destroyed. It was as if his conscience, long silent, had found a voice in madness. The names he cried out in the night were not just memories, they were indictments. He begged Anne Boleyn to forgive him. He demanded to know why Thomas More had chosen death over obedience. He cursed the Pope, the Emperor, the French King, God himself. His sleep was tortured and fractured, and in his waking hour, he stared blankly at the embroidered canopy above his bed, mouthing words no one could hear. The court tried to maintain the illusion of order. Ministers and nobles met in whispered gatherings to decide what would happen once the inevitable occurred. The future of England, its religion, its alliances, its leadership hung in the balance. Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, was already maneuvering for power. He knew the boy King Edward VI would need a protector, and he intended to be that man. But others had claims, two ambitions carefully hidden under masks of loyalty. Every noble smile concealed a dagger. Every whispered prayer for the king's health masked a longing for his death. And still, Henry clung to life. Each day he survived was an act of defiance against nature, against his enemies, perhaps even against God. He demanded to be carried to his council chamber, though he could barely breathe. He dictated letters. He ordered gifts for ambassadors. He had proclamations read aloud, even though no one believed he understood them. It was theater, grotesque and tragic. A man trying to rule from within his own grave. But his courtiers played along. They bowed and nodded and applauded, knowing full well that they were witnessing the final grotesque performance of a monarch who had built his reign on fear and fire. As his condition deteriorated, the question of his successor became more urgent. Though Edward was his legitimate male heir, he was only 9 years old. Frail, quiet, and untested, the boy visited his father's chambers just once during those final weeks, and even then, the sight of the bloated, festering king sent him into a week of nightmare. Henry looked nothing like the portraits. He was no longer the proud, athletic warrior in gilded armor. He was a monster, barely human, swollen beyond recognition, eyes rimmed with yellow, mouth flecked with blood. He did not recognize his son. He asked for the boy, and when Edward knelt before him, the king turned his face away, muttering something about him. The priests were finally summoned. Despite Henry's earlier refusals, the time had come for confession. But even then, the encounter was grim. The chaplain who heard his final words later said that Henry had not confessed scenes so much as recited justifications. He spoke of duty, of divine right, of the necessity of cruelty in a world of traitors. He did not ask for forgiveness. He insisted he had done what was required of him. When the priest asked if he died a Catholic or a Protestant, Henry reportedly growled, "Neither. I am the King of England." Those present took it as a declaration of power. But perhaps it was something darker, a soul too fractured to align with anything other than its own image. The weather turned colder still. Snow drifted in through cracks in the palace's aging windows. The great fires burned ceaselessly, but the king's chamber remained heavy with decay. His limbs began to swell with fluid, and blisters formed along his chest and arms. His lips cracked and bled. The pain grew unbearable, and even opiates could no longer soothe him. He began to choke on his own breath, and the doctors could do little more than hold him down as he thrashed and moaned. One of his closest servants later wrote in a private letter that the king screamed as if dragged into hell. His final days were filled with silence. He stopped speaking. His eyes followed no one. He refused food. He bit down so hard on his own tongue that blood filled his mouth. His hands curled into claws. The only sounds were his ragged breathing and the soft weeping of servants who had known him in better days. Outside the palace walls, London waited. Rumors had begun to spread. Merchants whispered of the king's death, though it had not yet come. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages home, hinting at transition. But inside, all was denial. The official word remained the same. The king is resting. The king is recovering. The king is strong. But no one believed it anymore. His body had become a grotesque symbol of his reign, bloated, brutal, and rotting from within. The man who had severed England from Rome, who had shattered traditions and redefined monarchy, was now a ruin. And as he lay gasping in his bed, the weight of his sins real and imagined pressed down like a leaden crown, his courtiers watched, waiting for the final breath, not with love, nor even loyalty, but with the cold, calculating patience of those who had survived a tyrant. They knew that history would soon shift, and they were ready to step over the corpse to shape it. But Henry lingered, as if reluctant to give them that satisfaction. He had ruled through fear for nearly 4 decades. Even in death, he would not go easily. The end came not with the thunderous finality one might expect from a king so saturated in legend and blood, but with a long, agonizing descent into stillness. By January 26, 1547, Henry VIII had stopped speaking entirely. His tongue, once so sharp with proclamations and judgments, lay swollen and useless in his mouth. His breathing was shallow, irregular, and audible throughout the palace corridors. The hissing, gasping rhythm became a morbid clock by which his attendants marked the passing of hours. It was as if the very act of respiration had become defiance, each breath a struggle against the inevitable. In those final hours, the privy chamber, once the center of royal intimacy and power, transformed into a silent, sacred waiting room of death. Only the most trusted remained. Sir Anthony Denis, Edward Seymour, Archbishop They waited in turns, their eyes fixed, not on the king's face, but on the flickering candlelight, as if hoping the flame would speak the truth they dared not say aloud. The king's skin had turned a jaundiced gray. Blisters ruptured and bled. His lips were dark, and a thin foam clung to the corners of his mouth. Occasionally, his body would convulse, as if the soul within it resisted being dragged down into whatever awaited him. At last, Sir Anthony Denis summoned the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Cranmer, the man who had helped engineer Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and guided England's volatile shift toward Protestantism, arrived just before midnight. He knelt beside the bed, his hand trembling as he took the king's cold, swollen fingers in his own. The priest asked Henry to affirm his faith, to die as a Christian. The king could no longer speak, but he squeezed the archbishop's hand faintly. That was all. No grand last words, no royal edict, just a barely perceptible motion from a decaying body. And then, sometime in the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII, Ireland and France, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England. But death did not bring peace. The announcement was delayed for days, hidden beneath layers of courtly performance. Henry's body remained in the chamber, dressed in rich robes, candles burning around him, as if to preserve the illusion that he still ruled. Messages were smuggled from room to room. Guards were doubled. Ambassadors were quietly informed through secret Edward Seymour and the Privy Council moved swiftly to seize control of the government, declaring themselves protectors of the new king, Edward VI, a child barely able to understand the weight of the crown thrust upon him. Meanwhile, behind the heavy doors of the king's chamber, his body began to change. Henry's corpse, swollen with rot and sealed in layers of silken padding, could not be contained. The leg wound that had plagued him for decades ruptured, spilling fluid and blood onto the floor. The stench became unbearable. Physicians hastily constructed a coffin lined with lead and sprinkled it with herbs, but even that could not hold back what nature had begun. There are persistent accounts, perhaps embellished by time, that the body exploded during transport, the pressure from internal gases causing the coffin to crack and ooze. One chronicler, writing years later, claimed the dogs were seen licking the liquid that seeped onto the church floor. Whether or not these details are wholly true is beside the point. The symbolism was too perfect, too horrifying. The king who had ruled with such unrelenting power, whose very name had conjured terror, now lay broken and bursting in death, a grotesque echo of his reign. His funeral was grand, but rushed. A procession of nobles, soldiers and clergy accompanied the bloated coffin from London to Windsor, where he would be buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife to give him a male heir, and the only one he seemed to have truly mourned. As the funeral bells tolled, England collectively for decades, Henry VIII had defined the kingdom. He had reshaped its laws, decapitated its traditions, and forged a new identity for the monarchy that would echo through centuries. He had brought both terror and splendor. And now, at last, he was gone. But peace did not follow. His death created a vacuum, a void into which ambitions, fears, and violence rushed like a tide. Edward VI, the boy king, was crowned days later in a ceremony that tried desperately to project stability. But those who watched knew better. The court fractured into factions almost immediately. Religious reformers saw their chance to push the country further into Protestantism, while conservatives plotted quietly to restore something closer to the Catholic past. Each noble family weighed its chances. Each general considered his loyalty. Every smile masked calculation. And yet, in the shadows of Whitehall, Henry lingered. Though his body had been buried, his legacy remained enormous, blood-soaked and unshakable. His laws still held sway. His break from Rome continued to define England's path. His heirs, 3 children by 3 different wives, would each inherit a kingdom haunted by his memory, and not just politically. The people spoke of his ghost walking the halls at night. Servants refused to enter certain chambers alone. Priests claimed to hear groaning behind locked doors. Whether those were true hauntings, or simply the residue of a deeply traumatized nation, is impossible to say. What is certain is this: no monarch, before or after Henry VIII, would ever be quite the same. He had changed the very concept of kingship. He had proven that a man could become the church, the state, and the executioner, all in one. And in doing so, he had created something monstrous, a throne that devoured those who sat upon it. In the years that followed, the blood did not stop flowing. His son, Edward, died young. His daughter Mary burned Protestants by the hundreds. His daughter Elizabeth reigned long and brilliantly, but never married, perhaps too aware of what that choice had cost her mother. The kingdom he left behind was fractured and anxious, its foundations built on fear. Henry VIII had claimed he was the father of modern England, but in truth, he had become its cursive shadow that stretched across generations. And so, as the snow melted and spring crept into London, Henry's name remained on every tongue, not as a blessing, but as a warning. Rule without restraint, glory without humanity. His final days, filled with rot and madness, were not an aberration, they were a culmination. The last honest expression of a reign defined by excess, cruelty, and the slow, suffocating collapse of the human soul beneath a crown. In the weeks following Henry's burial at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the physical presence of the king may have been gone, but the psychological grip he had on England, his court, his people, and even his own children remained suffocating. It was not merely grief or legacy, it was something far more insidious. The lingering fear of a man who had ruled with such force that even in death, his shadow remained more powerful than most living kings. Henry's death had created a rupture in the natural order of the Tudor court. For years, every law, every alliance, every act of cruelty had emanated from the singular will of the monarch. His word was law not because it was just, but because it was his. His tyranny had not been a series of isolated outbursts, it had been a system, one woven into the very fabric of governance. Now, that structure had been decapitated, and all that remained was chaos held together by ambition and fear. Young Edward VI had been crowned, but the child was a ghost king, fragile in body, soft-spoken, and shielded from the violence that had shaped his father's world. He was surrounded by men who professed loyalty but whispered treason in corridors and chapels. Edward Seymour, his maternal uncle, was appointed Lord Protector, but even he knew his position was temporary, a fragile perch atop a tower of knives. Every gesture, every alliance, every policy he enacted would be compared against the will of the dead king, and Henry's will, his literal last testament, was a matter of obsessive interpretation. In it, he had outlined the succession and named a council of executors to rule in Edward's stead. But the document was ambiguous, inconsistent, and ripe for manipulation. Seymour quickly began rewriting its meaning, consolidating power into his own hands. He claimed it was what Henry would have wanted, but no one truly knew what Henry wanted. Perhaps not even Henry himself. In this void of certainty, superstitions flowed. There were whispers in the court that the king had not truly died, that he had faked his death to test the loyalty of his advisors. Others believed he had cursed the realm before passing, ensuring that no peace would follow his reign. Some even claimed to have seen his ghost walking the battlements of Windsor, clad in black armor, his face hidden beneath a golden mask. Servants reported cold draughts and flickering candles, and some refused to enter his old chambers alone. But it wasn't only ghost stories that haunted the palace. The political ghosts, the very real consequences of Henry's tyranny, rose quickly. The kingdom was broke. Henry's wars with France and Scotland had drained the treasury. His debasement of the currency had unleashed inflation, and the common people struggled to afford bread. The monasteries had been dissolved, their lands seized and sold off to nobles, but the charitable functions they once served feeding the hungry, sheltering the poor, were gone. The streets of London filled with beggars, many of whom bore scars from wounds received in the King's wars or punishments from his laws. Religious unrest seethed beneath the surface. Henry had broken from Rome, but only half-heartedly. He had torn the church from the Pope, but not from Catholic doctrine. He executed Protestants and Catholics alike, dancing between extremes to maintain personal supremacy. Now, without his iron hand, the realm threatened to tear itself apart. Reformers demanded sweeping change. Traditionalists clung to the old ways. Sermons turned violent, riots flared, churches were vandalized, crucifixes were torn down, and behind it all, the memory of Henry, the man who had created this mess. Even the most intimate survivors of Henry's reign found no peace. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, remarried with unusual haste only months after his death. She wed Thomas Seymour, brother to the new Lord Protector and a man of notorious ambition. Their marriage was scandalous and quickly soured. Seymour's hunger for power became increasingly transparent, and Catherine, once the cautious consort of a tyrant, found herself trapped again in a dangerous game of courtly politics. She died in childbirth less than 2 years later, her final days marked by pain, betrayal, and isolation eerily reminiscent of her husband's own end. The children Henry had fought so hard to produce fared little better. Edward VI, his long-awaited son, would rule only 6 years before dying of tuberculosis at the age of 15. His reign was dominated by regents and ideological warfare. He would be remembered less for any decision of his own than for the Protestant revolution that swelled around him, driven by those who claimed to speak for the boy king. In his last days, Edward would desperately try to rewrite the succession, excluding both his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, In a final, futile attempt to preserve the Protestant future his guardians had entered, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, would seize the crown after Edward's death and attempt to restore Catholicism with fire and blood. She burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. But her own reign was brief and miserable, plagued by phantom pregnancies, foreign entanglements, and deep She died broken, her dreams of a Catholic England in ashes. And Elizabeth, Henry's second daughter, the child of Anne Boleyn, whom he had executed, would rule longest and best. Yet even she bore the scars of her father's reign. She never married, declaring herself married to her people, but perhaps she simply feared the consequences of trust. Raised in suspicion, nearly executed by her own sister, she learned early that love was dangerous, and power came at the cost of solitude. Her reign was glorious, but her heart was always guarded. And so the children of Henry VIII, the ones for whom he had torn his kingdom apart, all inherited pieces of his ruin. Each bore a crown heavy with blood. Each sat on a throne haunted not just by history, but by the grotesque legacy of the man who had created them. Even in art and memory, Henry's final image remained distorted. The portraits by Holbein, once vibrant and muscular, no longer reflected the truth of his last years. Artists avoided rendering the king as he had truly become, a swollen, stinking mass of flesh, riddled with disease, driven mad by pain and regret. Such depictions were too awful, too real. Instead, they painted myth, the majestic tyrant, the father of the Reformation. But behind that mask, the truth remained, because in the end, the terrifying thing was not merely that Henry died in agony. It was that he ruled for so long, for nearly 4 decades, and that even in his decay, people still bowed before him. That a man so visibly corrupted physically, morally, spiritually could still command loyalty, fear, and obedience until his final breath. That, perhaps, was his greatest legacy. Not just the Church of England, or the fractured Tudor line, but the reminder that power, when unchecked, can survive long past the body that wields it. The tomb of Henry VIII lies today beneath the cold stone floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. There are no golden effigies, no towering columns, no marble angels to guard the bones of a king who once demanded the world revolve around him. Instead, he lies in a plain vault beside Jane Seymour, the wife who died before he could tire of her, the woman whose corpse he chose as his eternal companion. There is a simple stone that marks the spot, a quiet, unimposing slab in a shadowed corner of the chapel, and there, perhaps more than anywhere else in England, the silence is deafening. Because despite the grandeur of his reign, despite the political earthquakes and the rivers of blood he spilled, Henry's legacy has always been defined as much by absence as by presence. The absence of heirs who could sustain the Tudor name. The absence of peace in a realm constantly reshaped by his will. The absence of mercy in a reign so steeped in executions that death became routine. The absence of love in a life filled with marriages but bereft of trust. Even in death, his tomb remains unfinished, as if even the earth itself refused to enshrine what he had become. And yet, Henry's story did not end in 1547. His ghost wandered through the centuries, not as a literal spectre haunting castles and corridors, but as an idea, a force, a warning. Writers and historians returned to him obsessively, drawn to the contradictions that defined him. A tyrant who could charm, a monster who could inspire loyalty, a visionary who destroyed more than he built. Plays, novels, operas, and films reimagined his life, sometimes as tragedy, sometimes as farce, and each version tried to make sense of what remained senseless. How one man could bend a kingdom to his will and leave it shivering in his wake. In classrooms and books, Henry is often reduced to bullet points. 6 wives, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monastery. But these facts, while important, miss the deeper horror of his rule. His terror was not in the acts alone, but in the casual, almost bureaucratic way he committed them. He did not kill in rage. He killed through signatures, with the stroke of a pen, in quiet rooms lit by candlelight. Friends one day, traitors the next. He created a system in which no one was safe, where favor meant scrutiny, and loyalty meant silence. And perhaps that is what made his final days so disturbing. Not merely the physical grotesquerie, the ulcerated leg, the maggot-ridden flesh, the festering wound that defied healing, but the symbolic justice of it all. A man who had inflicted suffering so coldly was consumed, piece by piece, by his own body. The king who ordered so many to the axe died not swiftly, but in prolonged agony, trapped in a prison of flesh, tormented by ghosts, both real and imagined. There is something inherently medieval in the nature of Henry's death. A dark poetry to the image of a ruler who once considered himself chosen by God slowly being devoured by rot. His courtiers might have adorned him with ermine and jewels, but beneath the velvet, he was decomposing. No amount of protocol or pageantry could hide it. In the end, all that remained was a body too bloated to bury immediately, a legacy too complex to praise, and a silence too profound to break. But perhaps the greatest terror of Henry's final days is not found in the grotesque details of his decline, but in their relevance, because Henry VIII is not a relic locked in the past. He is a mirror, one that reflects what happens when ambition overrides empathy, when power becomes an end in itself, and when institutions bend to the will of a single man. His story warns of the seductive nature of absolute rule, of the ease with which righteousness can become cruelty, and of how a nation can be reshaped by fear rather than hope. And yet, England survived him. Wounded, yes. Scared, yes. But not broken. His children carried his contradictions forward. The religious zeal of Mary, the steely resolve of Elizabeth, the frailty of Edward. Each tried in their own way to escape his shadow, but none truly succeeded. Even centuries later, the name Henry VIII evokes a visceral reaction. His portrait still hangs in galleries, his story still taught to children, his wives still catalogued in sing-song rhymes. But behind the myth is a truth far darker, far more unsettling. That power, wielded without limit, consumes not only the world around it but the one who holds it. Visitors to Windsor often walk over Henry's grave without noticing. They take photos of the ceiling, admire the stained glass, and pass by the plain stone beneath which the king lies. Few stop, fewer still realize what lies beneath their feet. And perhaps that is fitting, because in the end, the king who demanded the world look at him now lies ignored, and still, a silence at the heart of a nation he once ruled through screams. But if you linger there, if you pause in the hush of the chapel, with the late afternoon light spilling through the ancient windows, you might feel it. A weight in the air, a presence. Not a ghost, exactly, but something else. Something watching, something waiting. Henry VIII is dead, but the world he made, the wounds he left, the terror he embodied, they are not so easily buried. History doesn't always whisper. Sometimes, if this story left you haunted, know this: there are darker truths still waiting beneath the surface. Subscribe to Dark Hour's archive, where the forgotten echoes of the past never truly stay buried. We don't just tell history, we awaken it.